Hey everyone, it's Peter Kerr from Daydream Nation, and I've got the wonderful Todd Evans back to the channel. How are you going, Todd?
Good, thanks. Doing well.
Good to see you, Todd. We are going to do a episode on Paul McCartney. Now, specifically the Paul McCartney albums 1, 2, and 3. We are going to do a relatively deep dive or have a bit of a chat about the three albums. And at the end of the show, we're going to rank in order our favorite albums 3, 2, 1. As I normally do, Todd, we'll start off in order the albums. Paul McCartney 1, which came out in 1970. This was a little bit of a breakaway, a different sounding Paul to the excesses. And I don't say that in a bad way, but the very lush orchestral sound of Abbey Road. It was a bit of a hit, did really well. What was your first encounter with Paul McCartney 1? And then we'll just take the discussion from there.
It's confession time. My first experience with McCartney 1 was when this came out, the archive collection, which I believe is 2011. Prior to that, you can see the album behind me. I never owned that album. I always liked Maybe I'm Amazed, of course. I think everybody does that. And then around the time that this came out, I started really getting into junk and sing-along junk. But prior to that, for whatever reason, I think it was because, I couldn't go back so far to say that, when this came out, I was 6. So I couldn't really say, I got it when I was a kid.
Mm,
So my introduction to McCartney was the Beatles and Wings Over America and On, because my older sister had that. But I just never went back to this one. And I can remember, in pre-internet days, thinking to myself, isn't there a McCartney album that's got like a spilled bowl of cherries on it? Which one is that?
yeah,
Which I'm sure Beatles fans were like, who is this guy? But yeah,
yes,
I've never had much experience with this album. So
yeah,
it's been about, what is it, 2011 to 15 years.
yeah. Well, I think I'm probably the same as you. I've got a vague memory of Maybe I'm Amazed, but I think around 1970, which I was only 3, I've sort of more of a Beatles memory. I think Let It Be was
Yeah,
still the huge album because there was a plethora of Beatles material in 1970. You had Let It Be, you had Harrison's album, All Things
right.
Must Pass. You had John Lennon putting his solo album, but I think Let It Be was the one that got most of the focus. It was only way late into, going into a deep dive into the Paul McCartney discography that I sort of really got my teeth into this album. So, all right, we'll have a bit of a chat about this album. So, Todd, I'll put it to you. Do you think this is a deliberate path that Paul was taking to strip it down, play all the instruments, a mirror image to Abbey Road? Because Paul was very much front and center as the conductor, the orchestral conductor of Abbey Road, especially side 2, which is like a
Yeah.
piece of the resistance. Do you think this is a sort of like a reaction to that?
Well, I sort of feel like rock music was still too young for people to be thinking about, and I could be wrong, and definitely challenge me in the comments, but I think it was too early for people to be thinking about, well, I've made a lot of records that have a lot of production. Let me strip everything back. I think we were
Mm,
still in a zone where musicians were trying to get better and better and better and more complex. And if this was, I will say this, if this was a conscious effort by Paul McCartney to strip everything back to the basics, he was a real trendsetter because there were people who made records like that. Bob Dylan made records like that, but you didn't see many people who were really super popular going, I'm going to make an acoustic album. That seems like something of, that happened later. But
yes.
I think it was that he wanted to do it himself. And I think that was more important
Yeah.
than trying to strip back.
I think he's like a pioneer of lo-fi, this album.
Yeah, yeah,
And the do-it-yourself. There's so many singer-songwriters that, just, with a pickup and a guitar, you know, the lineage can be back to this album. I'm going to look at the album cover. I think there's a bit of irony because Paul's always been noted as the sweet guy, the ultra saccharine. Do you think he's doing a little bit of a piss take?
Yeah,
As
I think
Australian
so.
for, sending himself up a bit?
I have a lot of issues with this album, but the cover is not one of them. I think it's fantastic. And I even like the back cover. I sometimes think the back cover would have made a better front cover.
I
But
think he's
I
sending
know. I
himself
think
up.
that image is excellent.
Well, when we get into the tracks, it starts off with the lovely Linda, and you've got that wonderful finger picking, and it's so intimate and direct. And it feels like you're sort of peering into a conversation or something like a private moment. So you can tell straight away with the lovely Linda, which only goes for 43 seconds, that you're in for a different experience. Would you say that
Yeah,
when at the first track?
I think that if the Lovely Linda were any longer than 43 minutes, it would really annoy me because
Mm,
it's so simple. There was
mm,
one I was looking at this one quote from somebody who gave it a bad review, and they said basically he broke up the Beatles for this. And
yeah.
I kind of have that kind of feeling about I feel similarly about early John Lennon albums, is that I felt like, this is all very interesting and they're doing really cool stuff. And I mean, he basically did invent lo-fi, but at the same time, if you're a record buyer in 1970, I mean, did you buy this record and go, I'm sorry, what? What is he doing?
Mm.
He's just sitting around at his house banging on drums?
Well, he was definitely in the primal scream. But to
Yeah.
me, this album sounds like he's retreating to the farm, connecting for the family, decompressing from the Beatlemania. I mean,
Well,
in a
and
sense, they
they kind
were,
of tell you that. They tell you
yeah,
that in the pictures, that that's
yeah.
what's happening.
It's all about family. It's about connections. Not that there were, I mean, the madness of Let It Be, the end of Beatlemania. And, 1970 was a very, there was lawsuits left, right, and centre. So I think this was a reaction to that. And that's why there was a lot of intimate sort of songs. I think side one, I'm just looking from top to bottom, is pretty strong. Like that would be something. Again, you've got that wonderful finger picking. I mean, the playing on this album is really refined and sublime. I think Paul's guitar playing is really, really nice. And a lot of the bass pushes up in the mix.
Yeah, that's one
I
thing
think
you
you
can count on with his solo albums, that they were always going to have good bass lines.
yeah. Junk, you mentioned. You've got a bit of
Yeah.
a soft spot for that song.
Yeah, I think that's a really sweet song. And I think that it really works in a way that one of the songs that we're going to talk about on McCartney 2 doesn't work, in that it's very gentle and it's very sweet and it's melodic, and it doesn't sound weak. You know what I mean? It sounds like it's very effective. I don't know if we're going in order here, but I don't want to skip Valentine Day because I think it's terrible. Um, it sounds like everybody's, if anybody who's ever been in a band, it's like when I was in the 10th grade and we used to record band rehearsals on our cassette decks. That's what the drum sounds like to me. So, you go from That Would Be Something to Valentine Day, then you go to Every Night, which I think is pretty brilliant. So that's
So
kind
he's
of what
really going
has made
lo-fi.
me take a long time to really appreciate this record, is that
Yeah,
I
I
have
think
to
he's
just skip over the parts where I just think, okay, this is completely unfinished,
yeah, yeah.
and get to the good
Well,
parts.
I think he's just being raw and he's just putting it all out there. Going into side two, and I'm going to highlight Teddy Boy. So, Teddy Boy was a song that was workshopped in the Beatles because I think it's on Beatles Anthology 3. I'm sure the commenters
Mhm.
will tell me if I'm wrong or not.
I
And
think that's right.
this one is a very different sort of interpretational version. I think it's kind of got that whimsy because Paul loves the music hall, the vaudeville, and it's got that slight vaudeville feel type feel that he can't help himself. Do you like this song?
Yeah. Yeah, that's a song that really grew on me as I prepared for this show. And there was one that I used to not care for, and now I like it quite a bit more.
Yeah, it's what you call a ditty,
Yeah,
a Paul McCartney ditty. So I'll go to the song before that, Mama Miss America. What do you think of that one?
this is one that I also don't care for. I think that it almost, and I know a lot of people will disagree with this, but it almost feels like it's a demo that doesn't have the vocal track on it. And to me, it's a little bit jarring because of that. It's not grown on me, melodically. It's just kind of there. It's better than Ooh You, so
Mm,
it has that going for it. But
yeah.
yeah, I feel like I certainly don't mind it on an album like this. I think it fits right in, but I don't think it's one of the stronger tracks.
Well, I think of it differently. As I said, I think a lot of these tracks are raw, and I think he's been slightly experimental because he's always portrayed himself, especially in the later part of his career, as being the experimental Beatle. And I think, you can see that he's trying a lot of things. Some work, some don't necessarily work, but I think there's a forgiveness factor. But look, let's face it, in 1970, it didn't matter what he put out, it would go to number one. Everyone was just so
Mhm.
feverishly wanting the Beatles. I think we've got
Right.
to talk about Maybe I'm Amazed. That's probably the Stone Cold masterpiece. And if you have the
Yeah.
greatest hits, it always comes back to that. What a gem.
Yeah, and I didn't even prepare anything to say about it because I know everyone loves it. But it is one of those things where it's a perfect example of him being able to do it DIY from start to finish and have it come out great. And it almost makes me feel like I wish that he had done that more times on the record. I feel like Every Night and Junk and Maybe I'm Amazed are the songs that really feel like McCartney's songcraft. And, I went through half of my life thinking that Another Day was on this record. And I know that it was actually made during the Ram sessions and left off Ram. For probably 10 years, I thought that he left it off of this. That would have really helped this album, I think, if Another Day was on it. I know it's a year later, but
Yeah.
uh, but yeah, if this album had, I know I'm being slightly negative about it. If this album had one more really great McCartney song on it, and then the other stuff kind of in the middle, I would have a more favorable outlook on it.
Yeah, look, I think I really groove on the intimate moments, and I think the sum of the parts do equal to the whole. But look, a lot of it is wrapped around with Maybe I'm Amazed, second last song on the album. I like the vocals. He really pushes himself. I love it when Paul does a balls out vocal performance like "Oh Darling,"
Yeah,
in
yeah,
in
yeah, me
in
too.
Abbey Road, and he's really stretching himself. So you can imagine he's in the studio, he's got the microphone close, and he's really going for it. There's a lot of sort of sweep in this song, so you can
Yeah.
understand why people go to it. And anyway, this album came out. I think it was heavily criticised. I think they were sort of saying, "What?" People were
And I
expecting
understand
sort of.
why. I don't want to be too hard on it, but I understand
Mm,
why.
yeah. Do you think that's why a lot of people gravitated to the George Harrison album? Because that was lush, that was orchestral, that had sweep. That was the album they expected a Beatle to make, not
Right. And
this
if you
album.
don't count his earlier experimental George's earlier, more experimental album, All Things Must Pass is what people expected. And I actually kind of feel like that's really good that George made something like that and Paul made something like this because everybody just assumed that Paul would come out of the gates as the guy who would take all the success with him and leave everybody else behind. And that's not what happened. And so it's kind of a good thing that it happened in my eyes.
So maybe George made the album that people expected Paul would have made
Right.
by default. So, all
Yeah.
right, we'll move things along. So we'll go to 1980, and another album came out called McCartney 2. So Paul wanted to go back to the concept of just doing all the instrumentation himself. Now, 1980 was a very bad year for Paul. a lot of things happening.
Right.
Obviously, the loss of his friend, bandmate John Lennon, the tragedy there, the marijuana incident in Tokyo Airport, the legal problems. I cannot help but look at this album cover and look at his expression and think that that probably sums up his year. Like what you know. So the first single that came off this album was Coming Up. That this was a top 5 hit in Australia. It's kind of a zany sort of song. What was your first encounter with this album? Did you buy it in the day? And yeah, tell
I
us your journey
did.
with this album.
I have, well, this is, this album in the States comes with this, which is the live at Glasgow version on a 45 with a blank side
Nice.
two. And I absolutely loved the live version of Coming Up. And I can remember when I was in high school and 1980, when this came, spring of 80, I think. Is that right? Uh, I was uh, I was in high school and I was in the 10th grade, and my dad was involved in the fundraising aspect because my sister was a cheerleader. He was involved in like the booster club for the basketball team. And there was somebody in one of the parents who worked in the record industry. I think they worked for Columbia Records and just happened to live in Atlanta. And so they did this fundraiser where they had albums in the store, like I mean in the school, like on a Saturday, and all the albums were $5. But it was only certain albums. And I remember McCartney 2 was one of them, and that's where I bought it. My dad said you can have one. I'll buy it for you. And he bought me McCartney 2. And I was excited because I loved Coming Up so much, the live version. But when I got the album, I kind of felt like, oh, I could have, but there were other albums there I could have bought. I could have bought Gary Newman replicas. I could have bought, there were all these other albums that came out around the same time that were part of that little fundraiser. And I remember I tried to make the best of it, but I was a little bit disappointed in it. But the new wave fan in me liked some of the synthier things, and we'll talk about those. But yeah, that was my impression of this album, and I've always kind of felt like, did Columbia put this in the record because it was getting played on the radio? And there was a hype sticker on it that says includes a 7-inch of the live version of Coming Up. Or did they put this in there because they were like, you know what? This is not real strong. So maybe it needs a little something extra in the package. And so I've always wondered about that. And I have my own opinion on that, but who knows why they did it that way? Why the live version of the song was separate. I mean, I get it that, it as a piece of art, that this is really the album, and if you stick the live version on it, then you've sort of, disrupted the artistic integrity of the album. But there's such a disparity between the live version and the studio version of Coming Up. I mean, he's kind of singing it in like a nostalgic, like it's like the 20s or something. And I remember hearing that when I was 15 and thinking, what is he doing?
Yeah, well, he's got his funk out on that. I'll always love the video clip where there's this montage of all him playing different characters,
Yeah.
like the old timers. I think he's even wearing the Beatle uniform of the early '60s, and yeah, I think the film clip to me is a bit more memorable than the song. The song's kind
Yeah.
of a little bit of a throwaway, but it became a huge hit, and it's
I
kind of
don't
at
really know why.
odds.
I listen to it now and I don't really understand why I just flipped out about it so much when I was in high school, but I
Yeah.
absolutely loved it.
It's a bit at odds with the rest of the album because the album is
It is.
completely experimental and different. So I didn't really have any relationship with this album until much recently. And to be quite frank, it was like you and Grant and a few other of the Contrarian circles were talking about this album. So this is one of those ones where I sort of avoided, or, because I've got a lot of McCartney, but for whatever reason, this album was sort of like a bit of a missing piece. And it's over the last couple of years that I've played it. So I've got familiarity with Waterfalls, which was
Mhm.
a big song. Was that a big song in America? It was in the
It was
UK and
not. And as a matter of fact, I was just reading about that today, and Coming Up reached it was Coming Up did really well, and it peaked at number. Oh wait, hang on. In the US, Coming Up did really well. I don't know what its chart position was, but Waterfalls was released as a second single and it went unnoticed and it only got to number 106. And then as soon as
wow,
that happened, the album started dropping off the charts. So you could
yeah,
imagine that Columbia was probably starting to panic a little bit
yeah, yeah,
and that they
absolutely.
were
But
probably really happy when Tug of War came out.
yeah, well, that's another story. But Waterfalls
Yeah.
is a sweet song, and I really like that. But other than that, but this album has grown into cult status. A lot of people have pumped up its tires, and over a period of time, it has attained some sort of like upper tier McCartney reverence.
Hmm.
I think it's wrapped around that song "Temporary Secretary," which is an
Well,
absolute stonker of a track.
oh,
So,
I
so much.
absolutely loved it when I was a kid. I mean, when I was in high
Mm,
school, I absolutely adored it from start to
absolute,
finish.
very infectious song. So why don't we have a quick talk about that song?
Okay.
He's just being ultra. He's like a mad scientist with this song, isn't he? Really,
Yeah.
in the studio. What do you
Yeah,
think?
and I can remember, sometimes there are I always have felt like the at the time when it came out, the Thomas Dolby song Hyperactive reminded me of Temporary Secretary because you kind of feel like he's kind of going off the rails in the middle of it. And but yeah, I absolutely love it. It's a little bit the lyrics are a little bit awkward, but I just
Unhinged.
think that it's fantastic. I mean, other than that, the lyrics are a little weird, but yeah, and it comes after Coming Up, which if you've heard the live version first and it's 1980, and then you hear the studio version of Coming Up, and you might be disappointed. And
Yeah, it's like
then
side.
Temporary Secretary comes along and kind of kicks you in the butt.
Absolutely, it's like track two. But look, I think this is he's being avant-garde, he's being experimental, he's being a little bit unhinged, and I like it. And I
Yeah,
think a lot of the cult status of this album is wrapped around that song. Um,
yeah, and it goes with this picture.
yes, we talked about waterfalls. I think that's a sweet, lovely, delicate song.
I do too, but I feel like it's just a little bit too dour. It's almost depressing. And you know me, I'm usually a fan of things that are quieter and more ballady and like that. But for some reason, there's something about it. It might be because it's 4 minutes and 43 seconds long. It might just overstay its welcome just a little bit for being so gentle. But I wouldn't say it's my favorite song on this album, but it's a highlight. But
Yeah. Well, the song was actually featured on the series. I don't know if you watched it with Rick Rubin and McCartney on the Disney Channel. There was a series of 4 or 5 episodes where it was just McCartney in the studio and Rick Rubin would be at the mixing desk and talking
no, I
about
never did see that. I
experience.
really
Oh,
need
it's
to though.
really worth seeing. And Rick
Yeah.
actually did bring this song up. And McCartney was sort of, I thought he would have been a bit more enthusiastic. He just said, oh, it's a nice song.
I can't figure out why well, I sort of know why they picked it as the second single in the United States because I think it's the safest pick, but you almost can't hear it. I can't hear myself hearing it on the radio in 1980, but I don't think that they were brave enough to release Temporary Secretary. I think they probably should have, but they did not release it as a single in the States. And then when
Absolutely.
Waterfalls tanked so badly, they didn't try anymore.
That was
But I,
it.
I almost don't think that there is anything else that they could have picked.
Yeah.
Maybe On the Way, but
I
I'm not
like,
a big fan of side two of this album, which you're about to find out.
yeah. Just one more before we go to side two.
Yeah,
Nobody knows. I like that too.
I do too.
I think that's a really nice closer. Again, he's being very thoughtful. It's slightly experimental, but it's a different side of McCartney. Yeah, I think that's a nice closer. But I'm like you. I think side two, it really falls into a bit of a heap for me.
Yeah, yeah,
It's way too obscure. You know, it's all the things that you love about McCartney, the melody, the arrangements are kind of lacking. I love the experimentation, but he's just pushing it too far.
yeah. I like, some of the instrumentation because, like I said, I've read that during this time, he was starting to really admire David Byrne and people like that. And so I
Mm,
get what his motivation was to make some of those songs on side two, but I also, and for that reason, I sort of liked them. I probably liked them better then than I do now. But when I listen to this album now, I feel like side two is completely throwaway until you get to the last song. I mean, Summer Day Song is kind of nice. Summer's Day Song is kind of nice. I like that. But Bogey Music and Darkroom, I think, are just absolutely terrible, especially Darkroom. I just think it's dreadful.
yeah. So one of these days, you really think that's a nice
I
little
do.
closer, but
Yeah, I
it's
think
all
it
too
kind of
late
saves it.
yeah, but maybe a little bit too late to recover.
Yeah,
But yeah,
I agree. Too little, too
yeah,
late.
yeah, absolutely. So before I did this show, I actually downloaded this on Spotify. I do have the album, folks, and the CD and
Okay.
etc. And I just listened to. I was on coming back from the States, and I wanted to listen to this album start to finish. And boy, oh boy, you really do hear the drop
It's
from front parlor onwards.
it's
It
hard to keep it on.
without knowing where the album flips over. So it's
Right.
really noticeable. So
Hmm.
you sort of think, what's happening here? All right. So let's go to the more recent. This is McCartney 3, which came out in 2020. And this was a bit of a surprise. It came out in COVID. And I think Paul was just basically, let's put on a show, let's put on an album. Same principle where he does 99.9% of the instrumentation. I think there are one or two
Yeah, Abe
different,
Laboriel plays drums on one of the tracks, but other than
yeah.
that, it's mostly Paul.
But it was a bit of a surprise, and I think it was a kind of a bit of a cheer me up type project for the punters out there. That everyone was like in lockdown, and he just put this together to say, look, let's put on a show, and it did
And
fabulously well. It went to, I think, number one in the UK, or
uh-huh.
pretty close in America, number
Yeah.
two or so.
Yeah, and I think that he does a little bit better with the packaging of making it feel like the original McCartney album with the photos on the inside
Yeah.
and
Rolling Stone gave it a really good review, gave it 4 stars. They described it, it's the warmest and friendliest of quarantine albums. It's basically Ram meets folklore. So, what was your encounter with this album?
I bought it right away. I'm pretty sure I pre-ordered it or bought it very close to release time. And when I first got it, there were things I liked about it, and I generally felt favorably about it, but I put it away really quick. And you know, I had a couple of observations about it. I felt like, and I've completely done a 180 on all of these things. But first impression was I didn't like that. One of the things that I have trouble with McCartney's albums, pretty much from new on, is that I don't feel like he should be singing out of the range that he's comfortable in. I think when he sings too low or too high, you get this old man Paul McCartney kind of a thing where I feel like there's a sweet spot where his voice works very, very well together. But when this album came out, I thought to myself, well, I can't blame a producer. I think Paul just wants to sing in whatever register he wants to sing, and he's just going to do it, and nobody's going to tell him not to. And so when I kind of worked that out in my brain, I thought, you know what? I need to stop complaining about that because we all get older, and he's quite old. But I felt like there was too much. The first half of it was too much old Paul McCartney voice. And I just thought this is really good. It sounds very accomplished. The drums sound great. I mean, for somebody who's technically not a drummer, but considering he played a bunch of the drums on the White Album, he sort of really technically is a drummer. But I think that DIY, as far as DIY albums go, out of the three albums, this is the one that sounds the most like you have to be told that nobody else plays on it. I feel like with the other two, you sort of figure out that it's all him. But on this one, you kind of go, that could be a band. That could have been Abe on all playing drums on all the tracks, you know. I just think it's, you know, a little bit more accomplished. So when I started prepping for this show, it was when I really started listening to this album, and then I it went from trying to get to know it so that I could talk about it to listening to it for pleasure. So I can remember a couple of months ago when all the different color variant vinyl copies came out. I remember thinking to myself, I don't know if I'd want a vinyl copy of McCartney 3, but now I do.
Yeah, yeah.
So I had
I
kind of
got
an
it.
attitude adjustment about this album, and I've really kind of come around to it.
Yeah, I like this album straight off the bat, and I don't know. I think this was one of my cheer me up albums in COVID, because COVID was a very depressing time for a lot of us, and you know, it created our whole scene, didn't it, Todd? You know, we were into the
Yeah,
YouTube and discovered our interests, and I think
yeah.
this was one of the cheer me up type of moments in COVID, and to think that somebody so late into their life was able to pull something out that was quite had a lot of artistry, and
Has a
so
lot of artistry and it has a lot of energy
yeah,
for somebody
and
his age. It doesn't feel like it is done by a senior. It,
yeah,
it it
absolutely.
it chugs along very nicely, and then it has a lot of different variations in style. And so yeah.
Yeah, and lyrically very thoughtful. Like for him to
Hmm.
pull out something like "Women and Wives," which is just gets to the psyche of you know
Yeah,
relationships and social observation about life. Just
yeah.
very insightful that somebody is not really sort of treading water. In regards to the voice, I did see McCartney. I think he may have come out to Australia in 2019 or prior to that. He put on a show for 3 hours, but I was aware that his upper range, he didn't have the same vocal chops. But
Yeah.
what can you expect? He was like in his mid 70s at that particular time.
Right, right.
But I don't mind the fragility of the voice, because it adds that sort of vulnerability,
I'm
that
starting
sort
to
of
really appreciate
directness.
it.
You
Yeah,
can sort of forgive that. Um,
yeah.
and it sort of suits the material. But look, the first track where you've got long-tailed winter bird, and it's like a little bit of a he's got the acoustic guitar and he's got this riff, and he works on it, and it brings all the instruments into it. I really like that. Another
It's
thing
kind of
that
a
I
jam. It almost sounds like there's more than one person jamming in sort of a live setting. That's what it sounds like to me.
absolutely sliding. Now, track 7, I'm going to jump to that. To me, it
Okay.
sounds like he's been listening to the White Stripes and the
Yeah.
Black Keys, that
Yeah, I sort of get
do-it-yourself
that too.
type of bluesy. So I can see that he's listening to a lot of the outside influences. He's listening to a bit of Radiohead. He's listening to Jack White, but it's in the McCartney world, because there are some sort of references to his past sort of works, like Lavatory Lil, Polythene Pan, Lavatory Lil. That's
Yeah.
a lot of fun. He's just having fun and just getting out the rock guitars.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah. I absolutely love Find My Way. That's another song where I feel like it has some youthful energy to it.
yeah.
I think that Deep Deep Feeling, I no longer think that it's too long at 8:25, but I
Oh, I
think
love
that
that
when you
song.
listen to that, you get a real feeling for this is actually pretty experimental, you
Yeah,
know?
I've got that deep, deep feeling, and it's sort of it's and he's pumping it up, and it's kind
Yeah.
of ramping up the emotion, and you've got this wonderful echo. It goes for 8 minutes 25, but I wouldn't have a second less. It really
Yeah, it
it's
doesn't.
a
The
great.
more I get used to it, the less I even notice how long it is. Yeah.
Mm. Winter bird when winter comes. he brings out the delicate little melodies.
That is an example of him in the perfect spot of his range because he sounds like a young man singing that
Mm,
song. There's just this one particular part of his range, and that's it, where he still sounds like the old Paul. So yeah, I think Seize the Day and Deep Down could very easily be top 20 McCartney tracks. I think both of those are exceptionally good. I like both of those
absolutely.
very much.
But there is a school of critics out there that don't like this album, but I love it. I think
I'm not really sure. I mean, I was lukewarm on it at first, but I still liked it. But I'm
mm,
starting to love it.
I think it's got rewards if you play, on subsequent listens. Look,
Yeah,
I prefer this. I think it's head and shoulders above Egypt Station, and probably I think it's his best
I do
album
too.
in a long, long time.
Yeah, I feel like Egypt Station has highs and lows. There are
Mm,
some things on Egypt Station that I think are completely fantastic, and then I think other things that are kind of forgettable. This is kind of a I don't see any misses on this.
yeah,
So,
yeah. Well, Todd, he said that he's going to just keep playing on stage until he drops dead. So there are some artists out there that they have to from a,
uh-huh.
for a cash flow perspective, but he's just
Well,
doing it
I
because
would
he
prefer he
loves
take
it.
care of himself a little better, but
Yeah, but he's just going to keep on keeping on. He was in Australia last year, and I think look, I'm sure he'll do a tour of the States soon
oh yeah.
enough.
Hmm.
And 3 hours, and it's quite high energy. So I don't know how he does it, but he's just got that
Well,
gene.
and he also doesn't a lot. I've watched a lot of people as they age take the multitasking uh, portion out of their show. Like he could very
Mm,
easily come out there and just sing,
yeah,
but he's still coming out playing the bass and singing, which was is never easy for anybody to do at any age.
yeah,
And he keeps
yeah,
doing it. You go see Peter Cetera do one of his corporate private shows, and he's not playing much bass.
mm,
But
yeah,
Paul, every picture of him I see on stage, he's holding a bass in his hand. And I'm
yeah,
thinking, he's still
absolutely.
treating it like his job, and that, look, I'm a singing bass player, and this is what I do, so I'm just going to keep doing that. Neil Diamond, they made a big deal of it. I went and saw Neil Diamond, I want to say in 2005 or 2006, and he had like an acoustic set in his show, and he brought out an acoustic guitar, and they people made a real big deal about it. Oh, Neil Diamond's playing the guitar because he stopped playing the guitar, in the
Mm,
early 70s. So
yeah,
Paul could easily do that. He could be like, I'm 80 whatever years old. I'm just going to sing because that's going to take all the energy out of me. But he doesn't do that.
yeah,
He
yeah,
doesn't change anything about his show to make it seem like it's something that a senior would do.
yeah. I
And
really think his career, I've said this so many times. We've done a few shows on the Beatles and McCartney, and I really think that he's been reevaluated, his solo
yeah, I think so
career.
too.
Um, I definitely think that people look more fondly at the 70s, with
Mhm.
Wings and those early albums. I think 80s will probably have to catch up. So McCartney 2's definitely got
I
a
think
lot of,
80 should catch up, but anybody who knows anything about me will not be surprised that I would say that.
yeah. Look, I think there were yeah, I think it's some of the bigger, may I say, missteps with the duets. I don't know where you land on that. That may taint people's opinions. Um,
Yeah, I mentioned on another show recently on a Bicyclelegs show that I feel like he mainly gets his 80s the issue with his 80s image is basically Ebony and Ivory. And I think if Ebony and Ivory had not been released in advance of Tug of War and have its own single. I mean, I remember that song came out on a 12-inch and it wasn't even a remix. It was just Ebony and Ivory on
mm,
a 12-inch because Columbia wanted to get it out there. And I feel like if that was just the last song on Tug of War and it wasn't so hyped, that people wouldn't mind it as much.
yeah, and also the duets from with Michael Jackson, I
Yeah.
think are a little bit, less said the better. But yeah, I think that a lot of the 80s, he did some really fantastic stuff, especially Flowers in the Dirt. That's an album
Hmm.
that they don't talk about with Elvis Costello. And
Hmm.
yeah, I think the public will catch up. you know,
Well, Flowers in the
the
Dirt
next
ages really
generation will
well.
catch up with that.
Yeah, at the time, at the time when Flowers in the Dirt came out, I was slightly disappointed because I felt like it went a little bit too organic for him. I wanted it to have more complex production. But because he went that route, Flowers in the Dirt does not sound dated now. It doesn't sound like it's of any time. And so he probably knew what he was doing when he did that album the way he did.
Have you got the double LP or the double CD version? And it's the
Yeah,
loose demos between both of them.
yeah,
They're just it's just like us having a conversation, but singing to each other with
right.
guitars, and they're riffing and
Yeah,
they're on fire. I just think there's a plethora of material that will never get see the light of day, but in
yeah,
those
I'm sure.
sessions that should get out.
Yeah.
But yeah, look, I
Same
think
with Flaming Pie. Lots of stuff on that bonus disc that are really interesting. Him working with different producers, trying to figure out what he was going to do next. And
yeah,
yeah,
yeah. So I think the 70s that's definitely been reevaluated, but the 80s and onwards will catch up. But albums like this, where he pulls it out, are not harming his legacy in any shape or
no,
form.
no, not at all.
All right, Todd, let's do the ranking. So
Okay,
let's just do 3, 2, 1 for
okay,
you in order of the McCartney albums, and I'll
okay.
give you my response.
Here's where the hate mail comes in. You want me to go first or you?
Yeah, no, you go first.
All right. This is number three. I
Okay,
think too much of it sounds too finished and not professionally recorded. And I think that hurts it.
okay. And your number two, we'll just do it 3, 2, 1. Yep.
Okay.
Your number two is
Number two is
okay.
McCartney 2. Although
Yeah.
this should
So,
be no surprise after that last bit of conversation, but
but side two, if only it was an EP. I'm waiting for the
yeah,
hate mail for that.
yeah.
If only it was
Or
a
if only
short.
there were two stronger songs on the back end of it.
Yep.
Two
Yeah.
two two more. Yeah.
And I don't think there's any surprise what your number one is.
No, it's not. It's McCartney 3.
Wonderful. Yeah. Thank you. All right. Well, my number three is McCartney 2. As I said, the first side I love to bits, but side two, yeah, doesn't do it for me.
I
It's
almost
just
did that. I almost made that my number 3 for that reason.
yeah, it's way too obscure. And my number two, only by a B length, is McCartney 3. So my number one is actually, I just love this album. Look, it's raw, it's lo-fi, it's him being intimate. I just love.
Maybe I will get there.
Maybe I'm amazed you will get there. No, look, I think it's. I just think it's actually. I appreciate the artistry that he's just exposing himself. He's being raw, and it's warts and all. And to me, I think it's a nice little palate cleanser in his career that he's gone from the lushness of Abbey Road and Let It Be, which was not of his making, was like with Phil, into something that let's connect with the family, connect with nature, and just write these wonderful songs. I just think it's a groundbreaking album. It is the sort of he's like basically the pioneer of lo-fi rock. I think it's great.
He really was the first person to do it.
Absolutely. All right. Thanks, Todd. As always, great
Thank
to
you.
have you on the show. You can see Todd on plethora channels, The Contrarians. Just type in Todd Evans on YouTube. You'll see all these wonderful shows. Guaranteed you'll see him on Rock Daydream Nation in 2024 and beyond. Tell us what you think of these three albums. Have we got the order wrong? Are we being a little bit too harsh on McCartney 2, side 2? I'm sure you'll type in a love letter to us and tell us what you really think. But no, look, we appreciate reading the comments. Please like and subscribe to Rock Daydream Nation. But one thing's for sure, you'll see me and Todd doing a show very soon. Cheers.